Hello and welcome to this presentation as part of the MA in Digital Technologies for Language Teaching offered by the University of Nottingham. This presentation is part of the module on telecollaboration in language learning, and my name is Robert Martinez. In this presentation, I will be discussing telecollaboration, assessing online exchanges. The topic is telecollaboration and assessment. Let's start by looking at assessment and telecollaboration. So let's look at the different topics that we're going to be covering in this presentation. We'll start by going through a very brief review, literature review on assessment. Then we will talk briefly about assessment in telecollaboration. Then assessment of telecollaboration activities and Web 2.0 technologies will follow. After that, we will be looking at telecollaboration and the Common European Framework of Reference. We'll also discuss some issues in the assessment of telecollaboration. We'll look at telecollaboration assessment and the teacher's perspective. And then we'll finish with telecollaborative task design and assessment. And the very last part of this presentation will be the references. Now, let's get started. Let's look at a brief review. Let's start by looking at a brief literature review on assessment in general. 9 sites up to 50 different types of assessment. Now, assessment in general is a hot topic as educators try to find a fair way to determine the value of what they expect students to do. Although there are different types of assessment, these different types do not indicate that sometimes are better than others, as they are neutral, as Knight says, but simply that it is easier to match the type of assessment when one knows clearly what each assessment task is for. For instance, amongst the 50 different assessment methods available in the literature which Knight cites, we have to mention just a few, artifacts or products, especially in fashion design and engineering, for example, field. Assessment as gatekeeping. Students gain entry to classes only on production of bullet point summaries, for example. Also, assessment banks where students have access to question and answers, and then they learn how to answer all of them but are assessed on a sample only. Assessment of work-based learning, so in a variety of ways, many times by a variety of people for different purposes, and book or website or program reviews, just to name the first 5 of the 50 different types that Knight mentions. In general terms, whatever the type of assessment, they tend to either measure performance, in this case being summative assessment, or identify areas for improvement, that is formative assessment. So in general, we can see that there are these two main strands of assessment, so summative or formative. Now, let's look at assessment in telecollaboration. Let's look at assessment in telecollaboration. In the work of Guth and Helms 2012, some of the considerations are that we have to be aware of the context, and this may sound as a statement that we would say, okay, well, yes, that's clear. There's no need to say that. However, because telecollaboration takes place online through a variety of technologies, it is very important to be aware of the context, not just in what regards the people or the students or what you're going to do, but also all the different factors that would lead then to successful interaction. In this light, tasks are then central to assessment, and it is important then that when we're designing those tasks, that we are aware of the context. For instance, will assessment be formative or summative or both whenever we're designing the task? So we cannot wait until the end of the project or halfway through it to start thinking about the assessment. This is something that has to be done well in advance during the preliminary stage. But is something that has to be thought of a priori. Now, again, traditionally, educational institutions have opted for mainly summative assessment or assessment of learning. For example, Hounsell, Shu, and Tai, in their work in 2007, talk about assessment of learning as opposed to assessment for learning. Basically, assessment of learning is where we find feed out and officializes some sort of guarantee that the learner has acquired some competence, and this is supported by a certificate of some kind. Now, this is closely related to performance, and it is also high stakes assessment. So when planning our telecollaboration tasks, we need to be thinking of assessment right from the beginning and taking into consideration whether those tasks are going to be assessed adopting an approach of assessment of learning or for learning. Now, on the other hand, formative assessment, as we said before, assessment for learning, would allow the students to know what they need to do to move forward. As Black and William 1998 in Knight 2001 say, feedback on tasks. So this kind of feedback means designing learning sequences that afford plenty of opportunities for good learning conversations arising from feedback on good tasks that are matched to course learning outcomes. So assessment, while we're designing the tasks, we need to be thinking of the assessment as well, so that they are hand in hand, as Black and Williams say, matched to course learning outcomes. With this in mind, then assessment in telecollaboration can and must draw on constructive alignment principles that Biggs 2003 discusses. This is to help tutors differentiate learning outcomes from assessment criteria. So this is very, very important. Now, in terms of language use alone, students will benefit from a clearer understanding of what is expected of them, as tentative and definite language and low and high level verbs used in task instructions will represent learning outcomes and assessment criteria, respectively. If language is clear, then assessment will be also clear both for tutors and students. So for example, learning outcomes for task and assessment criteria. For example, learning outcomes and task and assessment criteria when measuring achievement. Now, Biggs 2004 mentions 4 steps for constructive alignment. He defines intended learning outcomes as being 1, choose and design of activities which will lead to the intended learning outcomes. As the second one, assess students' intended learning outcomes to see how closely they match what was intended, as number 3. And the last one, number 4, arrive at a final grade by applying grade assessment criteria as suggested by Moon in 2002. So these are highly recommended steps to be taken into consideration when designing or using ready-made tasks like the ones available in O'Dowd and Ware's 2009 work. Assessment in telecollaboration would then actively adopt and apply Moon's 2002 grade assessment criteria in the form of rubrics, which allows students to self-assess on the go, as well as the implementation of Hounsell et al.'s 2007 4 strategies for assessment. So feed-forward assessments, cumulative coursework, better understood expectations and standards, and speedier feedback, which would then set the ground for Carles's 2007 learner-oriented assessment, and hit the 3 elements mentioned. So assessment tasks as learning tasks, student involvement in assessment as peer or self-evaluators, and feedback as feed-forward. So as we can see, is all combined, is all part. Assessment is not just of a task and how it was carried out, but from the beginning, while as tutors and telecollaborators, we are defining the learning outcomes so that they match the task. I think that one of the issues in telecollaboration, as we will see later, is basically that mismatch between learning outcomes, expected learning outcomes, and the tasks themselves. Now, this would possibly take assessment in telecollaboration to the next step by making students not only task executors, but active participants in their own assessment and learning. Let's talk about assessment of telecollaboration activities and Web 2.0 technologies now. Web 2.0 technologies seem to be in every learning setting, and foreign language learning is no exception. I'm sure that you would agree. Assessment then, being part and parcel of learning, needs to make use of the same Web 2.0 technologies in order to reflect this new type of learning as suggested by O'Dowd in 2010. Lamy and Hempel in 2017 O'Dowd suggest that assessment is struggling to catch up. Because Web 2.0 learning is still in its adolescence. And also Stockwell 2006 states how Web 2.0 work is still being assessed via traditional techniques and technologies. And obviously we can see here, as I said before, another mismatch. We're using Web 2.0 technologies, but we're assessing those activities and interactions in a traditional way. So it is then not anymore a matter of just language learning, but also a matter of enabling students to develop intercultural communicative competence, or ICC, as mentioned by Schneider and von der Emde 2006 in O'Dowd 2010, and the role technologies play being central in the process in relation to assessment, because those technologies can also be harnessed to carry out assessment. Walker and White in 2011 argue that technology creates new possibilities for assessment, and so I wonder whether technology is being underutilized in telecollaboration assessment, because the focus is more on the technologies used for the exchange while still falling back on traditional methods to measure student performance. Now, Walker and White also mention several options for assessment, but the one that attracts my attention because of the work involved in telecollaboration projects is portfolios. In my personal opinion, I would argue that this type of assessment, which can be both summative and formative, would be, in Knight's 2001 terms, a better match for the types of tasks available. As I said before, one of the assessment options that attracts my attention is portfolios, because in my own experience as a tutor on the Trinity College London validated certificate in teaching languages with technologies, candidates have to produce a portfolio as part of the assessment. And in telecollaboration, I think that the different tasks, as we will see shortly, the different tasks that are already available and that are part of the work of O'Dowd and Wares, give plenty of evidence, or allow for the collection of plenty of evidence that could constitute those portfolios. Now, assessment is both ways. One important aspect of assessment is that we often forget it is bilateral, so that it involves teachers and students and teachers. And so students are often also involved in some sort of assessment of the course, and tutors. Dooley 2008 advises partner teachers to practice what they preach, and as telecollaborators, I believe this is to be important as it adds face value and rigor to our work. Dooley makes a case for peer work for learning and self-monitoring of progress as essential for learning, where, as she says, less marks, more well-made comments seem to lead to better results based on her experience. So it is not just us as tutors assessing telecollaboration exchanges and assessing our students, but we need to bear in mind that we are also under scrutiny. And if we are aware of this, then we're definitely going to be better prepared when defining the learning outcomes for the task at the beginning and not just at the end. As regards assessment, the use of criteria, grids, and rubrics, as mentioned before, are in line with O'Dowd's argument as descriptive scales allow teachers and students to identify where they are. It is also exciting to see that the lack of descriptors identified in 2010 by O'Dowd's work is to a certain extent currently being addressed by the work being carried out by the Common European Framework in terms of mediation descriptors, which started in 2013. So O'Dowd identified a lack of descriptors in 2010, and in 2013, in terms of mediation descriptors, started in 2013. For instance, two specific mediation descriptor categories, especially relevant to telecollaboration, are the two new scales introduced. One is basically called online interaction, which is, as we can see, relevant to telecollaboration because that's what it is all about, online interaction. And the two new scales are online conversation and discussion and goal-oriented online transactions and collaboration. All of this work is available online on the website of the Common European Framework of Reference. The other descriptors under revision are also relevant because of the nature of telecollaboration. They are cognitive and relational mediation. We're talking about mediation and telecollaboration. Telecollaboration is mediating, as we have seen, between cultures. It's not just language exchange, but also mediation and exchange and telecollaboration, collaboration and negotiation of meaning. Now let's talk about telecollaboration in the Common European Framework of Reference. Due to the fact that telecollaboration is about cultural and language exchanges, it is not surprising that the Common European Framework of Reference was brought to the game at some stage. O'Dowd's work in 2010 and his analysis of the links between telecollaboration and the Common European Framework are indeed interesting, albeit not new, and rather close to the concept of mediation, that concept of the conveyance of received information, especially so in the context of intercultural communicative competence, or ICC. O'Dowd uses the term when stating that communicating in a foreign language has as much to do with understanding and mediating, then using the term, with different cultural perspectives as with exchange of information. And I would dare say conveyance of received information. As regards assessment then, we can see that in his work, mediation and intercultural communicative competence are part of each other, or they're contained one in the other, because that mediation is extended or expanded within ICC. As regards assessment, the use of criteria, grids, and rubrics, as mentioned before, are in line with O'Dowd's 2010 work and argument. As open quotation marks, descriptive skills allow teachers and students to identify close quotation marks where they are. It is also exciting to see that the lack of descriptors identified in 2010 is to a certain extent currently being addressed by the work being carried out by the Common European Framework in terms of mediation descriptors, which started in 2013. For instance, two specific mediation descriptor categories especially relevant to telecollaboration are two new scales under the heading of online interaction. They are cognitive and relational mediation as regards the spoken discourse, and cognitive mediation as regards written discourse. Cognitive descriptors at spoken level include constructing meaning, and under this we have collaborating to construct meaning and general conceptual talk, conveying received meaning, and relaying specific information in speech, explaining data, graphs, and diagrams in speech, processing an entire text or texts, interpreting spoken translation of written texts, sight translation, for example, and relational mediation include facilitating relationships, facilitating collaborative interaction, managing interaction in plenary and in groups, resolving delicate situations and disagreements, which are clearly linked to telecollaboration. Some mediation strategies are also included in the new revision, and I would argue that they are also relevant to telecollaboration and the telecollaboration and assessment in telecollaboration, because these mediation strategies are also important, as negotiation of meaning is at the heart of any exchange. Establishing a positive atmosphere is one of the different strategies. Establishing connections, which in the literature is mentioned to be a determining factor for success. Establishing connections from the beginning with the telecollaborative partners. Amplifying text, streamlining texts, breaking down complicated information, visually representing information, and adjusting language. The difference between intercultural competence and intercultural communicative competence is of the essence here because of the implications alluded to by Barham in 1997 in the work of O'Dowd, namely that it is done in a foreign language. Now, Barham's ethical and moral statements deal with issues with assessing students, and the question posed is intriguing, in my opinion. Do I have the right to grade students for showing interest in how the members of the other culture perceive the world? What about bias? And what about the other culture's beliefs? So what about controversial views? For example, he mentions Israel and Palestine. In this respect, Burnett et al.'s 2014 questions regarding the extension of the value of rubrics, acknowledging the environments of rubrics, and managing the scale of factors affected by these require special attention. They also mention that there are new possibilities for assessment, and that these scales, it is important to understand how they work within an institutional environment. But I would argue from my personal experience that context in this case would be very, very important and would be determining in how a telecollaborative exchange happens. For example, I work in the private sector, and so This basically means that some of the recommendations that Walker and White 2011 make would not be of concern within a private school, within the private sector, like in my case, a private language school. For instance, their mention of value gained from video, audio, and screen annotation tools, amongst others, could be seen as listening to Walker and White's 2011 suggestions about how Web 2.0 create new possibilities for assessment. While their acknowledgement of the environment of rubrics is described within their context, and as such it may be seen as not immediately applicable in other different contexts, I would argue that what transpires as applicable is that assessment practices, particularly as embodied in a programmatic rubric, must flexibly and quickly respond to the new environmental cues from students, teachers, research, and institutional and societal factors. This is what Walker and White say. I would further argue that these cues would depend again on context, as private language schools would certainly find it easier to say so, to implement this flexibility and response, thanks to the fact that management is often more straightforward than in certain tertiary institutions, as it is Walker and White's 2011 context. Finally, as regards the management of the scale of factors affected by rubrics, it seems that the main concern in their context is that of increasing understanding of the scale of different levels, which again may not be immediately applicable to contexts where telecollaboration is in its initial stages. For instance, in mine it would be different. Now, let's look at some issues in the assessment of telecollaboration. Now, let's talk about issues in the assessment of telecollaboration. As regards O'Dowd's work 2010, his overview of research on issues in the assessment of online interaction identified a link between online assessment and participation as being one of the issues. I would say that these results are not surprising, and I would also say that participation is not and cannot be unilateral. That is one direction in which the teacher assesses students, but bilateral, as online students also assess tutors in terms of their online participation, basically their online presence. Another finding from in O'Dowd's work is related to the importance given in online assessment to affective aspects of students' online interaction, that is, how effectively students handle, intertwine, and build on interactive communicative competence, and how they build on their communication exchanges, in other words, basically. Finally, the third point, in the third finding in O'Dowd's work, reported in O'Dowd's overview, was the acknowledgement of tutors' own difficulty in the assessment of telecollaborative activities, which in my opinion points to the need of development in this area, with possibly an emphasis on both portfolios and assessment rubrics, as suggested before in the work of Walker and White 2011, as potential ways of assessing, potential ways or methods of assessing telecollaboration. I would say that these are particularly suitable because they reflect different shades in which these tools could support not only educators but also students in the production of tangible evidence, which becomes then more measurable. Now, let's talk about telecollaboration, assessment, and the teacher's perspective. There's no doubt that for the beginner telecollaborator, getting started, let alone also understanding how to assess a telecollaborative exchange, may seem a gargantuan task, with projects possibly being perceived chaotic and messy. However, the literature seems to indicate that this is mainly related to teaching style and level of control that teachers are used to exercising in the classroom. So I would say that pondering on Dooley's 2008 big question may be the key to reaching a compromise or striking a balance, if you want, in terms of involvement, with the teacher deciding whether they will be managers or facilitators. While other types of classroom activity assessment can be more straightforward because you give either a progress test or an achievement test, or you ask students to make a presentation and then you give them a grade. Assessing telecollaborative exchanges is not immediately clear, as has been discussed so far. Striking a balance is important because depending on our approach, as whether being a manager or facilitator, as Dooley points out, determining the level of control will also help determine the level of assessment or the effectiveness of the assessment. If the teacher is always in control, there will be very little space for the teacher to step back and then be able to assess more effectively. Approaching telecollaboration from a teacher's perspective could be argued to also intrinsically include assessment, as part of the teacher's job is that of measuring what the students do and to what extent. With this in mind, Dooley 2008 makes valuable recommendations for telecollaborative teachers to bear in mind, which I would argue are not an option but something we should do. For instance, being aware of teaching style is essential because tasks should reflect an active learning approach, which is often open-ended as opposed to a more traditional and also obsolete, I would say, obsolete teacher-centered stance. Assessment is then not of the learners alone, but also of ourselves as teachers and what we do in order to promote effective and successful activities. We need to be ready to assess ourselves first, ensure that what we're doing is in line with telecollaboration guidelines and the available literature to guarantee a degree of success. And this can be done by referring to the work of Dooley 2008, Dooley et al. 2012, Dooley and O'Dowd 2012, Lamy and Goodfellow 2010, and O'Dowd and Ware 2009, and O'Dowd 2010, as has been pointed out so far. Assessment is not seen as a set of criteria which is only applied to telecollaborative exchanges and to students, but to ourselves from the very beginning as a way of walking the talk. Again, I think this is my personal opinion, but I think that looking at Dooley et al.'s 2012, they suggest that in order to guarantee successful partnerships between collaborative partners, they should meet where possible face-to-face or virtually and follow the same orientation suggested for students so that they themselves can identify in practice. So in my opinion, this is how I see it. This self-assessment is useful in order to inform task and student assessment. What works and what doesn't work before bringing in the students could be identified if we do run this self-assessment from the beginning and not just when assessing the students. I think that it would be easier to transfer and understand and have a better understanding of assessment if we're able to assess ourselves from the beginning with our telecollaborative partner, and because this will help us inform from experience, from a first-hand point of view, the assessment that we want to carry out when it comes to our students. I think that this is especially so as having self-assessed our own preparation for the project will make us better able to see how the chosen or established criteria apply to the students. In a sense, this could be seen as carrying out our own mini telecollaborative project before launching on the one that we will lead the students through. So some sort of trial run, if you want. Finally, let's talk about telecollaborative task design and assessment. Drawing on the work of O'Dowd and Ware 2009, it becomes evident that their detailed set of tasks, telecollaborative tasks, can be a starting point for a novice telecollaborator. I mean, this would certainly be my case. And so here in this table, we can see the tasks that they suggest in their work in 2009. I basically added color and divided to be able to see visually more clearly the three different sets, and how information exchange tasks at the top increase in level of difficulty as they go down to comparison and analysis tasks, and then collaborative tasks. I would argue that starting from the study of the proposed tasks, so as to be familiar with them and also aware of their increasing level of difficulty, it would then be easier for the beginner telecollaborator to determine assessment for learning criteria that start from intended learning outcomes based on the tasks themselves. In addition, these intended learning outcomes could help partner teachers in the decision-making process as to whether the tasks chosen by them or by the students are in line with Dooley and O'Dowd's work. With this in mind, assessment for learning becomes an integral part of the telecollaborative process, as the tasks and the way they are defined by the partner teachers, not only applying them as they are, would provide students with plenty of opportunities for good learning conversations arising from the feedback given on good tasks and that are matched to course learning outcomes, as Knight says in his work in 2001. It becomes evident, in my opinion, that then it is of the essence to be fully aware of critical of our own and our partners' teaching beliefs and styles, not to take the tasks offered by O'Dowd and Ware 2009 or other suggestions just as they are. I think that just taking a task from the table as it is would be reductive of the work they have done in the literature. I believe that we should basically assess the tasks, assess ourselves in relation to our contexts, our students, and our intended learning outcomes to see how those specific tasks would best fit, or what they would need, whether they would need some sort of adaptation to ensure successful application. While choosing which task to implement, it would make sense then to attend to O'Dowd and Ware's and Dooley's 2008 findings by ensuring that, especially at the beginning, tasks are similar, or at least within the same set of tasks to facilitate adaptation. Facilitate adaptation, execution, and assessment of the same. For example, why am I saying this? Basically because, for instance, tasks for the project in O'Dowd and Ware 2009 were given from different sets. For instance, tasks for the project could all be from the given information tasks set, where there are 4 possible tasks, as you can see in the table. So task number 1, authoring cultural autobiographies, carrying out virtual interviews, engaging in informal discussion, exchanging story collections, rather than from different sets, because we need to bear in mind, and I believe this, I think that we need to bear in mind, and I would certainly do it if and when I will do a telecollaborative project, they change in level of difficulty. So why choose a task from the first set for one group and a task from a different set for another group, if they're supposed to be at a similar level? That's one of the questions that I pose myself. In this case, so as they say, choose them from the same set rather than from different ones, because in case study 1, they chose task 3 from set 1, and they chose task 10 from set 3, which, as mentioned before, are also at different levels of difficulty. I think that this approach seems to be supported by the evidence in case study, where it is suggested that the success of these instructors lies, amongst other things, in their planning and preparation, in their choosing straightforward, predictable tasks, which allow the students to find their own ways to connect with others. I would say basically that this in turn is nothing else but what argued by Guth and Helms 2012 as regards task design requires consideration of the specificities of online context to be effective. And again, assessment is not just of the students, but assessment at 360 degrees. And finally, here we have the references on which I based this assignment and presentation.